back to the Question Table, a podcast of the Way Home Ministries. I'm your host, Sylvia Geronimo. I'm so glad you're joining me as we explore yet another great question. There is a question that sneaks up on us quietly. It doesn't usually announce itself in our 20s, when everything still feels like it's ahead of us. It doesn't always show up even in our 30s or 40s either, when we're busy building and raising and striving and surviving. But eventually, if we're paying attention, it taps us on the shoulder and asks, "What now?" Now, for some people, that question arrives after retirement papers are signed. And for others, it comes after children leave home. And for some of us, after a loss, or after a diagnosis, or after a long season of doing what was required, finally loosens its grip. If you know Richard Rohr, he calls the season falling upward. And he has a book with the same title. I encourage you to read it. Others call it the sunset years, or the second half of life. And Lamott, in her wonderfully honest way, says she's living in her third of life. I love that phrase because it doesn't sound like decline. It sounds more like arrival. But here's the thing. You don't have to be old to ask this question. You just have to be awake. Because at some point, all of us pause and realize we're no longer asking, "What should I achieve?" We're asking, "What am I meant to give?" And that's where the question, "What now?" becomes sacred. This question matters because it's not about doing more. It's about seeing differently. It's about recognizing that God doesn't waste seasons, and God doesn't waste people, and God certainly doesn't waste the long road that brought you here. And what brings us to a word that helps make sense of the season, a word that feels especially tender and true in the later chapters of life, is this word, convergence. So I want to read this slowly because every sentence matters, and I invite you to listen. You can even pause if you want to return to this, but listen carefully. Convergence is one of those quiet holy words. It never shouts, it just gathers. Most of our lives feel scattered. We collect stories, we collect heartbreaks and skills, we collect our prayers, we remember mistakes, we have courage, we express compassion, and sometimes we have wisdom we didn't ask for but earned anyway. At the time, none of it seems connected. It just is life happening in pieces. But convergence is what God does with the pieces. Convergence is the moment when everything you've lived and learned and carried and given starts to lean towards the same point. It's when your experiences, your failures, your loves, those questions that are still unanswered, your endurance, and even your wounds all arrive at the same table at the same time. Especially near the end of our lives, God often offers opportunities of convergence, moments where nothing is wasted. What you know meets what is needed. What you've suffered meets someone else's suffering. What you've practiced in private finally serves someone in public. Your past stops being a story you tell and becomes a gift you offer. But convergence isn't just about what you've done. It's more about who you've become. At its heart, convergence is when you bring your best self into a moment. And it's not your perfect self, you know that, and you've accepted that. It is not your impressive self, it's your truest self. That self that is shaped by grace and humility and courage and forgiveness and love, the one that knows how to listen the one that knows what matters and what doesn't anymore. In Convergence, God doesn't ask for your resume, He asks for your presence. And you show up with your whole story integrated, no longer fragmented. You're no longer trying to prove anything, or to fix anyone, or to rush anywhere, or to control. You're simply offering who you are. And somehow, mysteriously, that's enough. Convergence is when heaven whispers, everything you've lived for has been preparing you for this moment. And therefore, you no longer perform or impress, but you just give, wisely, gently, and faithfully, and you give the best of yourself. So that is what this question, what now, is really asking. It's asking whether we believe that God has been paying attention to our whole lives, whether we believe that the scattered pieces are actually being gathered into something meaningful. And Scripture gives us a powerful picture of this in the life of Joseph. You remember Joseph. Joseph's story is found in Genesis, and it is not a story of a straight line. It's a story of betrayal. It's a story where life is delayed because of false accusations and forgotten promises, and it's a life of a long waiting. Joseph is sold by his brothers. He's imprisoned unjustly, and he's left to rot in obscurity long after he's done the right thing. Nothing about his life looks efficient or purposeful in the moment. It just looks like waste. But years later, Joseph stands in a position of leadership he could never have orchestrated for himself. And then a famine comes, and his brothers show up looking for help, and they stand before him desperate and afraid. And Joseph finally sees the convergence of his life. He says something extraordinary. He tells them, "You meant this for harm, but God meant it for good, to bring about the saving of many lives." You see, that sentence only makes sense in hindsight. Joseph couldn't have said it from the pit, and he couldn't have said it from prison. He could only say it when everything converged, when his suffering met someone else's need, and when his hard-earned wisdom met a moment that required discernment and restraint and mercy and courage. When we read that story and enter into that moment with Joseph, we see that he didn't just bring his skills to that moment. He brought his whole character, who he had become. He brought a self that was shaped by endurance. He brought someone that exercised humility. He brought someone who had learned to forgive and to trust in God's hidden work. And that's why convergence is not about being impressive, but it's about being available. This is also why Jesus so often noticed all the people at moments of convergence. What comes to mind is Simeon and Anna in the temple when Jesus was dedicated. These were not people in the spotlight. They were people who had waited. When Mary and Joseph brought the infant Jesus into the temple, Simeon recognized what others missed. He could say, "My eyes have seen your salvation, O Lord." Not because he was sharp or relevant, but because his whole life he had trained to recognize God when God arrived quietly. That's convergence. And it tells us something important about the question, what now? The question is not asking you to reinvent yourself. It's just asking you to offer yourself. This question matters because without it, we risk drifting into either regret or restlessness. We risk replaying the past, wondering what we should have done differently or what we should have chased, or find ourselves chasing as the next thing, hoping it will make us feel useful again. But convergence invites us into something gentler and braver. It invites us to trust that God is still active in our very lives and still arranging meetings between who we are and what the world needs. But friend, here's the honest part, is that convergence requires wakefulness. It requires willingness. And it asks us to stop numbing ourselves with distraction or resignation and instead say, God, if you're gathering the pieces, help me to notice. It also asks us to release control, because convergence is not something we manufacture. It's something that we cooperate with. When we look back at Joseph, he didn't force the famine, and Simeon didn't schedule the Messiah. They simply showed up, ready. And so that's the invitation of this season, whatever age you're in, to bring your truest self and to stop apologizing for your limits, to stop hiding your wounds, to trust that the wisdom you earned the hard way is not a liability, but a gift. So when you ask, what now? You're not asking for a new ladder to climb. You're asking where your life can now lean towards love, where your presence can steady someone else, where your story, fully integrated, can serve quietly and faithfully. And then maybe that's the answer. What now? Well, now you show up. Now you listen more than you speak. Now you offer what you have without needing to prove its worth. Now you trust that nothing has been wasted. Because convergence is God's gentle assurance that the long road matters and that somehow mysteriously who you are is enough. And that's a beautiful place to begin again.